Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial where today we're going to be taking a look at sharpening inside of Photoshop. And we've not got one, but two different techniques that we're going to take a look at today. And without further ado, let's get started. Now, the first thing you're going to want to know about sharpening is that it should always be the last thing you do to your photo. You don't want to sharpen it and then continue working on it because it won't really hold up to a lot of abuse is what I tend to find. And also it's just not a good kind of workflow habit to be getting into. Just make sure that it's always the very last thing you do before you save and close. The other thing to be aware of is that if you're, let's say, going to scale an image down to put it on a website, you want to make sure that when you sharpen at the resolution you're going to use. So you don't want to have a massive high-res file, sharpen it, then scale it down and put it on a website. Because when you do that, the sharpening effect is kind of knocked out. It doesn't really work. When you scale it down, the sharpening kind of disappears. So you want to scale the image down and then sharpen it at whatever resolution you're going to use. So that being said, let's talk about how you do it. Now, I think it's always good to work in layers, so that's what we're going to be doing, and sharpening is no exception. But in order to do that, we kind of need a copy of everything in our document on one new layer, and we can do that by creating a stamp visible layer. And we're going to do that by pressing Command, Alt, Shift, and E, or Control, Alt, Shift, and E if you're on the PC. And this has given us this new layer here, which is basically like flattening all of this stuff and putting it in a new layer, but we get to keep all of our original layers, so there'll be no difference when I turn this on and off. So now that we have that, I'm just going to quickly rename this Sharpening, and now I'm going to go up to Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. And we've got a few different options in here that we're not going to be using, mostly because these are kind of, lacking a better word, they're sort of relics from the early days of Photoshop. So Sharpen, for instance, when you click that, it will just sharpen your image by a set amount. You don't get any options with it, it just kind of does it. And it doesn't really do a very good job of it, to be honest with you. Sharpen More is exactly the same thing, but it sharpens it a bit more than Sharpen does. Again, you have no control, it's not a great tool. Sharpen Edges is kind of a bit of a specialist thing, and Smart Sharpen is not as useful as it sounds, unfortunately, in my opinion. But Unsharp Mask, which is very unintuitively named, is fantastic. So, what we've got in here are a few sliders and this dialog box here. So if I click anywhere in my image, it's going to give us kind of a zoomed in view of what we're working with. And I'm actually just going to zoom in on the image itself because we actually have a live preview of what the tool's doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick these settings up to silly numbers just for a minute so you can kind of see what's actually happening. And I want to talk about the threshold slider. Now, what the threshold slider does is make this tool incredibly powerful because it effectively allows you to cancel some areas out of the sharpening. So, for instance, at the moment, it's going to pick up all of this kind of noise in the background here. If we start to bring this up, it's going to identify that as an area of really high detail, and it's actually going to get rid of it from the sharpening. It's going to say, okay, well, we're not going to deal with that bit. We just want to focus on kind of the major features in this image. So that would be the text and kind of the edges of the label and the bottle and that kind of thing. And that's what makes this really cool because it's very good if you've got some images that were shot at high ISOs that you need to sharpen. And that's kind of where this tool's main power lives, in my opinion. So that being said, the radius is kind of an interesting one because once Photoshop has identified which pixels are going to be sharpened, so let's say, right, all of the pixels along this edge are going to be sharpened, it's basically saying we're going to sharpen those pixels and then every pixel within 9.1 pixels. So it's basically saying, right, all of this white bit and then there's kind of a bit that's gone black there are being sharpened either side of that line, and that's going to be about 9.1 pixels, or exactly 9.1 pixels away from that point. So this is just like which neighboring pixels get sharpened as well, if that makes sense. And then the amount is fairly self-explanatory. It's just kind of how much do you want to sharpen it. So, you can bring that down. You can kind of play with these as much as you like. But what I tend to find works quite well is you want to get the threshold, I think, generally about somewhere between like about 7 and 15, depending on the image, works pretty well. And we'll get rid of most noise except in extreme cases. And once you've done that, you want to play with the radius. So I think that the radius for something like this image here, which is I believe it's a 22 megapixel image, about 3.5 or 4 is normally pretty good. If you go much higher than that, then you start to get this kind of weird halo effect coming up. But 3.5 I think will be pretty good. But I will point out that that setting in particular, so radius, will matter depending on the resolution of your file. If you're working with a very low resolution image, say something you scaled down for a website, you might only want to use like underneath the pixel, so like 0.7, 0.5, something like that. If you happen to be having the luxury of working on 100 megapixel Hasselblad shots, then you might want to go way higher. It's just play with this until it looks right for your shot, basically. And then the amount, I tend to find that somewhere between 100 and 150 will generally look good. It's kind of just, that one is up to you, down to taste. But generally that is kind of what you want to do. You don't want to be going for a really high radius and really low amount. It's not going to really have the same effect. You want a fairly high amount and a fairly low radius. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and hit OK. And as we kind of tick this on and off, you can see that that is really making things kind of pop out of this image, but it's not really dragging out all this extra noise that's in the photo as well. But the one downside to Unsharp Mask is if we zoom in here, you can kind of see, even though we set the radius quite small, we have got this kind of weird sort of haloing effect going on. And, that's not particularly pleasant. It's kind of a giveaway that it's been sharpened. So what is the alternative? Well, this is where my favorite sharpening technique comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this layer off for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and create another stamp visible layer of everything in our document. And we're going to call this one Sharpening 2. So this one, we're going to go up to Filter, Other, and then High Pass. And what this is going to do is give you this kind of grey looking image and a slider. And you can almost kind of think of this one, I know it says radius, but this is more like an amount filter. So you could have this kind of really low, or you could have it crazy high. And what you're going to see is that as you slide this up and down, you're going to start to see more and more features of your subject kind of pop out of the grey. So I like to get it so that you can, it's kind of down to taste again, but something where you're just starting to see enough of the details that I want to see some of the detail in this card come out. I'm not really seeing too much of the noise come out, but it is there and you can sort of see that. So now that we've got that, we're going to hit OK. And this obviously doesn't look very good. So what you need to now do is, with that layer selected, you need to change your layer's blend mode to overlay. And when you do that, you now get this wonderful sharpening technique, or wonderful sharpening effect, I should say, but you don't get the same kind of glowy nastiness that you get with Unsharp Mask. And obviously the one downside to this is that this is kind of one of these ones where you don't have a threshold to speak of. Arguably, the slider does kind of do that to some extent, but as you can see, it is sharpening all of the noise in the background. Now, the one benefit of doing this on a layer is you could actually add a layer mask and you could paint out the bits that you don't want to sharpen, so you could get really selective with it. I'm not going to do that in this episode because I don't think it's particularly necessary, but the point is it's an option you have. The same thing is true with the Unsharp Mask. If you do that on a new layer, as we have here, you can do that as well. Now, one thing that is quite useful to be able to do is you can actually change your layer's opacity to kind of, reduce this effect. If you think that, your sharpening effect is a bit too strong, you can kind of bring down the opacity and kind of change how much that actually shows up, which is quite useful. The other thing is that this effect will actually work with a couple of other blend modes, so it doesn't just have to be overlay. If you think overlay is a little bit too harsh, you can actually use soft light, and that will give you a slightly gentler effect, but it is still going to sharpen your image and make things pop a little bit more. Now, the other option you've got is you could use something like hard light, which is actually going to be an even stronger effect than overlay. So if we switch back to overlay, you can see it's just a little bit gentler, but there's not a lot in it. But you've got those kind of three are the main ones that you can play around with, or, you could do linear light, but then that gets a little bit garish, I think. But there's a few options there that you can play around with. Generally, I find that overlay is probably kind of a good midpoint, and then you can decide if you want to go up or down from there. But I think that is going to do it this time, guys. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Toby, and we'll see you next time.